So now we're going to work on a pen and ink watercolor painting. And in this case we're starting with a traced base design, but if you want to start with your own hand-drawn base design, then that of course is quite fine. You would just take a pencil and sharpen it and draw the shapes that you wanted to draw, and that would give you this pencil starting point. So either way is a great way to get a starting point for your shapes. So the second step in doing a pen and ink with watercolor style painting is to have the pen. So the pens that I use are called Jelly Roll 06 from Sakura, and they are waterproof. You can use any pen that you want. The important part if you're doing this kind of project is that it's waterproof, because we're going to draw something down with the pen and then we're going to paint over it with watercolors, and if the pen is not waterproof, then the painting process is going to mush all the pen all over the place, and that would not be the effect we're going for. We want to be able to have the pen stay still, and then the watercolors add a highlight to it. So for example, here's one of my other drawings, and you still want to be able to see the pen and then see the watercolors to sort of color in the pen drawings that you've done. Oh, I've got one of the other cats here. It's just going to be a cat kind of day, and that is fine. Okay. What are you up to? Alright, well, so far she's staying over there. I have two cats, Felix and Zuzu. They are siblings, and they are black cats, so they like to participate in these art sessions. Alright, so when we have our pencil drawing, and we have our Sakura, and one of these pens wasn't working properly, so I guess we'll find out by trying one of them and see if it's the one that works or not. Right, once again, I'm drawing around the tripod here. Are you going to come help? Are you thinking about helping, or you're just pondering, sitting there for a while? Alright, cat is staying still for now. Alright, and now we're just going to draw with pen over the lines that we have. And the reason you draw with pencil first is that it's very easy to erase pencil and get everything where you want it. With pen, once you put the pen down, it's pretty much down. So this gives you guiding lines to be able to work with and make sure that the pen that you draw is going where you want it to do. Oh, and this seems to be the functional pen, so that is wonderful. So it's good to go reasonably slow and careful with the pen, because once something does down in pen, it is pretty much down. But it's also good just to accept your art for the stage that it's in. We're all in different stages, we all have different challenges. My hands tend to be shaky, for example, and that's just the way that things are. So I'm sure we can all think of artists who draw things that have wiggly lines, and people love their art. So it doesn't necessarily have to be computer straight, and if anything, if it looks computer straight, then people think that it's just drawn by a computer. It's good to have a little bit of wiggliness in your art to show that it was drawn by a human being and someone who is practicing and working on their skills as an artist. You guys can ask any questions that you want to ask, and when I see the comments, I will post with answers for you. Alright. Funny how those wheels don't quite look like they're touching the ground in the same spot, but it's just a trick of the eye, I suppose. I'm trying to draw around this tripod, so that's sort of part of my challenge here. That comes down to that line. And it goes across there. I'm trying to do this reasonably quick so that you guys don't have to sit here for a long time just watching me trace. So you get a sense, but normally I would go a little bit slower than this. You can go as fast or as slow as you wish. Alright. Done. We got the whistle. And we got the bell. All sorts of backup systems, so if the whistle fails, the bell can always just be clanged. Oh, that was supposed to be an angle. There we go. Bands, hold everything together. Alright, and then I didn't draw on a lot of these little inner details because there was no need to trace them. But now I can start adding those kinds of details on. And just finish up with the cow catcher. Cowcatcher dealt with snow and fallen branches and all sorts of other things on the tracks. Alright, what other kinds of details should we add? So let's see, this thing has a band that goes across. Let's see. Do that. That stops there. That goes through there. And it's also worth saying that this is your piece of art. So just because something is a certain way in the original one, you don't have to make it that way. If something has vertical stripes and you want horizontal stripes, you can make yours to have horizontal stripes. It is up to you. You can change the colors. You could change anything that you want. So this has like little dots on it. But if you don't like little dots, you could put little squares. Put anything that you want. Is that getting most up? So we got our box shape over here. Right now this has snowflake theme. If you want a different kind of theme, you could certainly do that. It is up to you. I happen to like the snowflake theme. Alright, so we got a snowflakey thing. We got this. We got the little dots. Got the bell. Got the front part. anything else? I suppose. All the spokes. And again, you don't want to watch me drawing in pen for an eternity, but I think you get the gist of the idea for the pen part. So we're going to go fairly quick for the spokes, and they will be fairly rough. That's alright, you're getting the idea. Spokes. Keep the wheels strong. So are you guys train fans? Let me know in the comments. I think trains are pretty neat. Only 2 more wheels to go. And I think we'll be done. Alright, so we have the basic shape done by pen. And like I said, you could go much slower with that, put in a lot more detail, change things up, but I think you have the general idea here of how this works. Oh, I guess we want a top line across the top of this. Can't see what I'm doing around everything. Alright, that'll do. Alrighty, so this step is done to get the pen and ink down. So again, to summarize, you want a waterproof pen so that if you're doing watercolors next, when you're working with the watercolor, it doesn't smear the pen. The pen should be resistant to the watercolor step. If you're not going to be watercoloring this, or if this is your final step, then any sort of pen will do because you don't have to worry about the effects of water on it. But in my particular case, where I am now going to be making this into a watercolor image, I want to be able to have something that will not smear. So I just need to run and get some watercolor paper. I will be back in just a moment. So you can take a small break and grab yourself some coffee or tea.
Sit down and think about doing it. Let's see.
Alright. I got some water. So now we're going to talk about watercoloring. And for watercoloring, you want watercolor paints, watercolor paper, some brushes, and water. So You can get watercolors in many different formats. You can get pan watercolors, which are the kind that you often see in schools, which is a preset tray that has the different colors set into it. And I've worked many times with pan watercolors, and they are certainly lovely. The challenge is once you use up a given color, like once you use up that particular blue, now the pan of watercolors is sort of less useful because there's no way to easily refill that one. So what this is here is a metal tin that comes empty, and then you fill it yourself with watercolors that come in tubes. And my tubes seem to have vanished on me. Here we go. So they come in tubes that are shaped like this. And you can get exactly the colors that you want, and there's a lot of watercolor in here. So it's liquid inside here because it's sealed, and then when you need to put more into one of these, you squish it out and it goes out into that thing, and then it dries in here, just like your pans have little dried circles or little dried squares or whatever they are. So it's perfectly fine that they dry. That's their purpose in life, is to dry, and then when you want to use them, you wet them. So everything sits in here dry. You can store it dry, you carry it around with you, and then when you're ready to use everything, then you wet it down and you start painting with it. So I like this system because I can choose exactly the colors that are useful to me to put into the set. And then if I run out of a particular color, I just take my tube and squish some more in. And if I keep using blue over and over and over again, and then I need to get some more blue, I just buy another tube of the blue paint and squish some more in there and work on that one. And if I hardly ever use this orange, then I use those tubes at a lower rate, so it's more cost effective and it lets you do exactly what you want to do. Alright, so we're going to talk about a number of different watercolor techniques here. And we will start with the background of this image, and we will use wet on wet technique. So right now the paper is all dry, and if I were to paint something on it, which is the way most people start out watercolor painting, the watercolor paint would go wherever I put it, and it would stay in that spot because the paper was dry and there was nothing else to suck the water into a different location. When we wet the paper so that it is all wet, and if we start putting paint down, the paint will spread out into the wet area through capillary action. The water will suck it out and to spread in that area. So that makes a much softer, gentler effect, and that is great for background parts because often you see in pictures that the background is soft and fuzzy while the object in the foreground is nice and sharp. So we're going to put in backgrounds of trees and grasses and such that is nice and fuzzy. Well, and the tracks. The track is going through a meadow area in this version that I am going to do. And then the foreground will be sharp, and that way it'll draw the eye and catch the attention. So the first step in doing this is to get the background area wet. So I'm just looking at my brushes to see which brush is best for this. Alright, so we're just going to use this brush. I get my brushes very inexpensively in bulk. You can buy batches of 12 brushes or 24 brushes for $5, so brushes don't need to cost a lot, and certainly you can buy more expensive brushes if you have the money to do that. But if you are getting started and you can only afford inexpensive brushes, that is okay. They will be fine. Alright, so we are going to start just with water, and we are going to put water down all around the outside, and it's very dry in the house right now. So I'm going to do this in 2 stages because this water is going to dry pretty quickly. So I'm going to do, let's do the front first. So I'm going to do all this area down here just with water, so not with any paint to start with. So, I'm going to paint this. My boyfriend's coming and spraying the room with mists of water to try to help. But we need to get the humidifiers all running. Because this is going to dry faster than I can paint it. So again, you can't really see what I'm doing because I'm painting with clear water. I'm just putting water down on the bottom half of this paper. And I'm going to try to not get it into the train area because this paint is going to go wherever the water is and spread out amongst the water areas. And I don't want the paint to go into the train. I'm just trying to make green grassy foreground here. Now something else you may be able to see that is happening is that the paper is starting to curl a little. Watercolor paper does this naturally, and there are multiple ways to deal with this. If you find this to be an issue, you could tape the paper down to the surface that you're working on. I don't do that here because I need to keep turning it and such. But I could tape it down to a piece of wood or something like that and then turn the wood. So there's different ways to get around that problem. You can just let it do that and have that be part of the challenge of working with it. You can pre-wet the paper so that it goes through this stage of curling and buckling and then uncurling before you get to the painting part. But just know that it's going to do this depending on how heavy weight of paper that you use. So now I have Zuzu, who's the female cat of the sibling pair, who was about to come over and start stepping on everything, but fortunately she seems to have decided not to. Alright, so now that the paper is wet, when I take some paint, so I dip the brush in water and now I'm dipping it, and this was dry but now it's getting wet. When I layer on here, you see how it's spreading out? That will spread. And also, because there's these curls and slopes in this right now, it is going to go down slope, so it's actually affected by gravity and by this curl that's in the paper. And we'll put tracks in later, but we're not worrying about the tracks right now. We're just worrying about the soft colors that we want in the foreground and in the background. So you don't have to be precise when you're putting down colors into wet, because the colors are going to spread naturally on their own. Now let's see, this paper is already starting to dry, so it depends on how humid or dry your environment is with how long you have to work on this. So I'm going to put it a little brighter right up around the engine to give a sense that there's sort of shadows happening from the train. Alright. Now the other thing you can do, it's also worth noting that watercolors dry lighter than they go down. So however dark this seems at the start, it's going to get lighter as it dries. So put it on darker than you think it should be. And also remember that you can, of course, touch it up and add layers. So we're going to add some little flowery things. Little grasses. I'm going to rinse out all the green. I'm going to add in some little red flower things. Now the thing to note is that this is wet, so everything's going to spread, so you're not going to get exact shapes. You're just making a general impression of things. So you can't be too picky about exactly where something ends up or exactly what it looks like. Alright, so see how things are spreading out and billowing, and I really like this effect. There might be some who are used to doing things in a super realistic fashion and who get concerned by the fact that things are billowing and going where they want to and spreading. But that makes me happy. I like that sort of thing. So to summarize for this bottom part, we painted it with water, and then while it was wet, we added some watercolor paint into the different areas, and the watercolor paint spread and blossomed out in the wet areas, so it wouldn't go into the train area because that's dry. It was just getting sucked into the wet areas, and it does it in a sort of uncontrolled manner. So these red round shapes, I did not control how the ending shape was going to be. I made a little dot of red color and then it spread out naturally. So you could consider that a fun type of way. Or if you don't like the wet on wet technique, then you could do things wet on dry where you maintain some control. Alright, so that is drying very quickly. And now while that is drying, we will work on the top area. So I will comment that this is still wet. So if I painted right up against it and started doing things, that color would get sucked down into that wet area because all the wet areas would get sucked into each other. So I'm going to leave a little gap between the two so that this area up here does not get sucked down into that area down there. So, well, let's actually do it. Let's do a green area in the middle and then a sky in the top. You can see that I've got cat hairs. It's a fact of life around here. And you could just brush those off at the end. They will not get stuck in the paint or anything like that. So don't worry about that sort of cat hair kinds of stuff. So this will be the trickier part in terms of painting because I need to make this wet, but I want to make it wet around the train shape. So these big areas are fine, but these little tiny areas in here are trickier, and everything is drying so fast that I don't even know if I'll be able to get back in there before it's completely dry and not wet anyway. So we will find out. We'll do the best that we can. And that's part of the painting process. Do the best you can and see what happens. Alright, mark out around the coal. And again on this lower area I want to be careful not getting too close to that green because I don't want this area to get sucked in, become part of that area. Alright, so I'm going about halfway up this section before I get to what's going to be the sky. And if you look at things from an angle, you can usually tell what is wet and what is not wet. Figure out if you put things in the right area. Alright, so that's going to be a background green, like the trees and stuff, so I'll use this one. Or that could be a little too bluish, maybe. So we'll put down a quick base layer of that on the sides. And then, how about this one? Yeah, that's a better one for the main part. So you can try different colors. See what you like. See what works well for you. So you have to work reasonably quickly because things are drying while you're painting. And if it gets too dry, then the colors won't spread anymore the way that you're hoping that they will. So you have to get them in there. So again, a purpose of wet on wet is to get this soft fuzzy effect, which is especially good for backgrounds, but you could do a whole painting in this style. You could do a field of flowers where everything is just soft and fuzzy and gentle, like it would be on a spring morning. Or you could do a wintry scene where everything is soft and fuzzy. All sorts of options. You can see how the color just sort of drifts and fills in the spots. want to keep it separate from the lower grass so that you get this sense of a background and a foreground. I just want this hill area to be soft, because I want it to be like the rolling hills that we have here in Massachusetts. Alright, so you go around and look for any places that don't seem as if they've gotten enough color. Alright, I will turn it right side up. Another reason that it was helpful to paint in that direction is the way that I hold my brush. It lets me get into the nooks and crannies more easily because I'm right-handed and I'm coming in at things from that direction in general. Be able to make all these little edge areas. It's just easier to me coming at it from that side. So you'll find when you paint which way is easier for you, and always turn the paper around so that it makes it easiest for you. Alright. So that's the background trees. Now we could add in, while it's still wet, a few little, let's stay with that same green, a few little darker splotches to be bushes. Again, you can see that it's moving, and that's okay because the idea back here is just to give the general sense of stuff happening in the background, but nothing too detailed in particular. Everything sort of merges together, and that's fine. Alright, get a general sense of how this wet on wet works. Hey Luke, good to see you. So Bob, I'm drawing the steam train. Bob's Luke McNeil says they're probably drinking coffee and smoking big cigars. Alright, let's give it a sky. So I'm rinsing my brush again so it's nice and clean. Just tilting it a little so it's easier for me to get to around the tripod. And I want to make sure that this layer does not touch the tree layer so it doesn't suck the green out of the green layer and into our blue sky layer. Normally I would sit here and wait for it to dry, but we're doing this quick for the video. So we are just doing this while the other side is still wet. And I don't know if you can see, but the paper is once again buckling and curving. That's because it's getting wet. So again, you could counter that by taping your paper down onto something, including the table, or by pre-wetting it so it goes through this process, or by weighing it down, or just by letting it do it, which is what I'm doing right now. It'll be what it'll be, and that's alright. Alright, so now we get a blue sky. you want to leave some areas white to make clouds, you can leave them white. You have control of the art. It's your painting. You can do whatever you want to with it. And again, remember that it dries later, so you want to put in more saturated color than you want to have in your final image. And most of the time with watercolors you do things in layers, so you put down some, you let it dry, you put down a little more, you let it dry. So this would just be the starting layer of the overall painting. Alright, we're going to go riskily close to the green. But fortunately, at least so far, we have not got any giant blue streaks down into our green trees. Alright, so we have got generally the start of a background in. And again, this could be just the first layer. You could put in many other layers as this dries, but this gives you a starting point. So this was all done wet on wet, where I painted the area with water first, and then while that area was still wet, I added in some color, so that way the color could blossom and spread and have that soft effect. I will rinse the brush off. Now I will get a smaller brush. Maybe this brush. Alright, so you want to wait a few minutes until the surrounding area is dry-ish. Because if we were to start painting this train area while this was still wet, and then we tried to paint something in here, it would touch the wet and it would just get sucked right out into the wet, just like these flowers got sucked out to pull along with capillary action. If we tried to paint something delicate in here and it got a hold of this wet area, it would just suck right out and create these long streaks of black or whatever color we were working with. And that would be less than wonderful. So this will dry for a minute. So when we are painting on dry, in general, the paint will stay exactly where we put it with the brush, so it's a much more controlled technique. So that is how most people start out learning to watercolor, where they put things just where the brush is going to be. In watercolor, in general, they talk about painting from light to dark. And that's because if I was to paint this with a very light color, like yellow, let's say, and then I started painting black, the black is always going to cover up the lighter color because it's darker. So if you paint the lighter colors first, and then you paint the darker colors will cover up the lighter colors where it overlaps, and you can still leave the yellow behind. If you painted with a darker color, like you painted all the black stuff in, and then you tried to paint yellow over it, it wouldn't work. The yellow would not cover up the black. Because in watercolors there isn't a sense of colors covering and hiding each other. There's a sense of colors layering and blending. So like in this section here, I painted with green, and then I added the red dots. And since the red dots were darker, see, they covered right over the green. So it's not like you see red, green flowers. They generally look like red flowers. So I didn't have to leave holes for those red flowers. I just painted it green first and then painted the red right over on top of it. So think about that when you're doing watercolors, that you generally want to start with the lighter colors and put those down, and then put darker colors down, and you just need to be careful about where you put the darker colors, because while you can try to scrub away at an area with a wet brush to lift up the paint again, the paper will stain with the color, so it never really gets back to a pure white, so it's hard to remove a color once you put it down, depending on the quality of your paper and how thick the paper is and all sorts of other stuff like that. Alright, well hopefully, now that we've talked a bit, this is fairly dry so that we can start the train painting process. Alright, let's start back with this coal car. And it has, I bring my little color thing back. Again, I don't need to use these colors. I can use any colors that I want to, but I sort of like this red-green pattern. And I suppose this is a Christmassy pattern, but I set it in a springtime scene, so Well, you could have painted it in a winter scene if you wanted to, or you could do another one in winter and do like all the different seasons of the train. So, well, with that being said, do I want to use these same colors? I think I like black for the train. And maybe I will do blue. Black and blue and yellow? What do we think of that? Well, maybe we'll give that a shot. You, as the artist, can use whatever colors you want to. But we're going to start with the lightest colors. And that's going to be the snowflake in this case. So I'm going to do this yellow here for the snowflake. Part of the beauty of watercolors is that the light goes through them. So where other kinds of paint block the light, with watercolors, the light goes through the color, hits the paper, and bounces back from the paper to your eye. And that's part of why watercolors look like they glow so much. They have sort of a stained glass feel. And it has to do with them, in essence, being backlit. That the light is bouncing up from the paper at your eyeball from the paper. So the paint tends to be fairly thin and light so that the light can do that kind of effect. But as part of that, when I want to put these little yellow dots down, I can't paint the entire thing red or something and then try to put yellow on top of it, because the yellow won't be able to be seen against the red. It'll just be a very dark color anyway. So you need to leave those little spots open so that it's just yellow on the white. Do this rail. So when you're looking at what you want to paint first on your watercolor painting, think about all the lighter areas first. And there's even, if you want to keep things pure white, and like say that's a really detailed snowflake and you want to keep it pure white, but it's going to be really hard for you to paint all the little edges around it, watercolor has stuff called frisket. And frisket is a masking liquid, which means it's like rubber cement. So you would put down, you would put down frisket on the snowflake shape, and it would make a barrier against that snowflake so that no paint could get to the paper there. And then you would paint all around it, and you could paint right over it because the frisket was protecting the paper. And then at the end you would rub off the frisket again, so it's like a rubber cement kind of thing. You just rub it back off again and it would come off, and then you would be left with the whiteness of the snowflake there. So there are bunches of different options for you to do. What do you want to do over here? I think we'll make this yellow. But what this means for watercolors is that generally you don't do the kind of technique where you, let's say that we wanted to paint that whole area dark blue and then put on yellow spots on top of it. You couldn't really do that because the yellow spots would not stick on top of the blue area. You need to leave holes for where you want the lighter colors to be and paint around them. So it's a different way of thinking about painting than maybe some other systems that you have worked with before. Alright. Now what color do I want to make the windows? Do I really want to make those things green, as if you're seeing through to the grass? I think for the window parts, I want to make them light blue, as if there's glass in them. These windows often have that kind of blue tint to them. And I suppose for this open window area, you could have that be a green, as if we're seeing through to the green of the trees beyond. There we go. Alright. So we'll give the little yellow bits a moment to dry. So now we're going to go with a blue or purple. What color is this blue? That's a nice blue. Why don't we use this blue? Right, hopefully the yellow of the star is dried. I'm trying to do this at an angle. We'll see if it works. It'll get trickier as I get closer to the star. So you don't have to have 80,000 different shapes of brush. Many artists just use 2 or 3 brushes for different purposes. I tend just to use a big generic brush for these big areas. Sorry. And a littler generic brush for these little areas. But like I said, brushes are quite inexpensive and usually come in sets anyway, so there's no harm in getting a set and seeing which ones tend to work for you. So I'm trying to paint into these little nooks and crannies around the star without covering the star, because if I get something blue in there, well, see, it's starting to run a little bit in there, so the star wasn't completely dry yet. That's alright. Like I said, we're doing this quick. Normally you'd want to wait until the star is completely dry so that you didn't have a chance of the new color touching and running into the old color. But we get a sense of the blue against it. Alright, so over on this area, what area should we make the blue versus the black of the main kind of area? Let's make the top of this. So again, the challenge is that this yellow is still fairly wet, and anywhere that I paint with the blue that happens to touch the yellow risks getting sucked into the wetness of the yellow and causing problems. But that's alright. We are showing how this works. And art is about practicing and trying things and seeing what works. Don't get too worried about a particular painting being absolutely perfect. Everything helps you learn skills and learn new techniques and figure out what you like to do. And as I mentioned, there's certainly enough famous artists out there who got a great reputation while doing wiggly paintings or not straight lines or all sorts of things. So whatever your style is, there will be an audience for it. Alright, so I'm not being super concerned about the space around these dots right now, because I am doing this fairly quickly, but you could sit there and be super cautious around every dot. Make sure that they all stood out. Make sure that your blue did not get sucked into the yellow, and so on. Alright, So we got that part done. Blue there. Some blue there. All sorts of little blue accent pieces. What color do I want for the spokes? I could just make them blue too. We'll keep a simple color theme here. Alright, so let me know if you have any questions about any of this. Watercolor is a great art form to play with because the watercolor paints in general are fairly inexpensive. They are easy to clean up, they are non-toxic, they are based with water, they wash up with water, so there's generally no concern about fuss or fumes or any of those other kinds of things that you might have with some other types of paint. And it's something that all ages can enjoy, and all abilities. I'm getting more casual as we go, just to get this done. Alright, so I think you get the sense of how this works. So now we want that to dry a little bit so that when we do the next layer that's touching in against it, it doesn't flow into that existing layer. It's all about managing the water and how it flows. But fortunately it doesn't look like any of the paint that we just did flowed out into the outer trees and the other things in the previous layers. So we're going to dry that off. I'd originally thought about having multiple colors, but now that we're just going to stick with those two colors, I'm going to get some yellow and put yellow in these accent pieces. Imagine what it must have been like to live back in the 1800s at a time where the fastest you could go was riding on a horse, and not everyone could afford a horse. So most people just walked slowly from one place to another, and the world that you could see was the world that you could walk to on your own 2 feet, which tended to be a very small area. And then these trains came along, and suddenly you could go off and see really far away, distant places. You could get there very quickly. That was an enormous change in the way things were done. Alright, there we go. Alright, let's just give that a moment to dry. Alright, so the thing about black is that black is a very dark color, but as you can see, watercolors tend, at least on first layers, to be fairly light. So often to get a nice dark black, you have to do multiple layers of it. So you'd put down a layer and you let it dry, and then you put another layer on top of it and let it dry, and so on, layer after layer, to build it up so it's nice and dark. And it's good in a painting to have a range of light to dark that's visually pleasing for the eye. So when you're doing pen and ink, you have a default, you've already got some dark in it, so that helps. But it's also good to have some darker colors and some lighter colors. We have plenty of lighter colors in this because watercolors just naturally tend to be light. So we want to be sure to have a couple of darker colors in here to be able to have some, like I said, visual interest for the eye, because that makes the painting tend to seem more pleasing and realistic and complete and all those other kinds of things. So something to think about when you are crafting your painting is what kind of dark areas are there and what kind of light areas are in there. Alright, so we're adding in, and again remember that watercolors tend to dry lighter than they go down. So however dark this appears right now, it's going to get lighter, and then we'll have to put on another layer to make it darker than that, and then another layer, and so on until we get it to the nice dark color that we are hoping for. I'm a little nervous about painting in here because if this blue is still wet, it'll suck the black into it just like those little red flowers got sucked. And also, if we get black on top of this yellow, it will stain it permanently black. So this is where being attentive to what you're doing comes in. Because this black, if it gets on something that it shouldn't get on, will be pretty hard to get back off again. And as I mentioned, I'm trying to paint around a tripod here, so that adds an additional layer of excitement. That's alright. Teaches us to be humble and in the moment, meditative and calm. Well, it's also worth saying that there's potential for disaster, that if you were really fond of how this painting was going and then all of a sudden you get a giant black streak against it, it could make you sad. But it's a life lesson that everything is impermanent. Have you ever seen those Tibetan monks who make big drawings called mandalas out of sand? So they make this massive, beautiful drawing with all sorts of colors and all sorts of layers, and they make it solely out of sand, made with little straws to put the sand where it goes, and then when it's all done, they blow it all away. So it only lasts for a short period of time, just like the actual universe that we live in. So it's a good reminder that there is beauty everywhere. Every moment holds beauty, and then things change, and that's just the way things are. In the original version, this square right here is part of the engine, had a thin line of different color. That sort of thing is harder to do in watercolors, because in most other paint forms like acrylics or oil paints or something, you would just paint the whole box a base color and then add the thin line. But you would not be able to do that with a lighter color, an accent color, because the lighter color won't show up against the darker color. And otherwise you'd have to leave a gap. Yep, see, I'm starting to get some little black parts. That's alright. We're doing a test. So the way to try to draw up paint is you rinse the brush so there's no color on it. You squeeze out the water so it's damp, and then it acts as a little vacuum cleaner, and it can draw up a little bit, but it's not going to get it back to a pure white state in general. If your paper is really thick, you can use a wet brush to sort of scrub at it and scrub out the color. or you could even put it under a sink and wash out all the color completely. But again, often it still has a staining to the paper where you can see hints of what the color used to be, which could be a really nice effect if that's what you're going for, but it generally isn't like you can just wash the paper back to a pure, completely blank state. Alright, I am going to turn the paper so I can get into these areas. Again, because of me being right-handed, it's just easier for me to get along the edge of something if I rotate the paper to be, I guess, opposite my wrist is where you could think about it. But you'll find for yourself, try different angles, see what works best for your wrist and how you hold your brush. The more you practice and try things, the more you'll see how your own particular way of painting works. Alright, so the wheel rims were a color in the original one. I suppose I could still do them with a color. Let's paint around them for black for now. I can make them blue or yellow or something. Alright. Just let the area dry for now while we think about that. So what color did you guys paint your trains? Did you go with blue and yellow, or did you go with red? Or something else? It's wholly up to you how you want to paint yours. And remember, if you use the tracing paper, you have the shape traced. So if you want to make another one, you just trace out another one with the graphite paper, and you can make it a whole different color. You can make a whole collection of these. Like I said, maybe one for spring, one for summer, one for fall, one for winter. It's up to you. And you could do one quickly to see how the process works, and then you could do one slowly to put more attention to detail in it. I'm doing this fairly quick so you get a gist of how the process works. And I could go back and do a very slow one that I did for a winter scene. Right, so if I did yellow in that box area right now, I think that black is still wet. I could suck that black in. Well, it actually held up pretty well, so that black was pretty dry. Alright, so I just add a little yellow edging in there. Alright, so we've got some black in there. You can see that it's not very dark black yet, because we've only put on one layer, but that's something that you would put layer after layer on, and each subsequent layer would make it darker and darker, more saturated in color. Let's see if we can get a rim on these tires. Wheels. Wheels. Alright, so I'm getting a little more blue. Now I just painted that black, but that's dried really quickly because it's so dry in here. So I might be able to go in and add the rims without having all the black smear. Alright. The wheels on. detail in the spokes. So again, when you're doing watercolors, think about light to dark, because we put those light yellow areas on, and if we wanted to add some darker details to those yellow areas, it would be fairly easy to do that. But once we start putting these dark areas in, it's very hard to add light details to that, because the light details would not be very visible against that dark that is already there. And for watercolor purists, you can never put anything onto here that is not see-through. So everything you put on is watercolor paint. But if you are not a purist and want some cool effects, you can do something like, this is a very bright white paint called bleed-proof white, and this will sit on top of an image and just be a pure white spot. So it's a different kind of thing than traditional watercolor, in that it lets you put on something at the very end which sits on top of everything else and blocks out the layers beneath it. And that would be if we were doing a night scene and we wanted to have a starry sky. You could paint the entire sky dark blue or dark black or something like that, and then spatter stars on top of it, and the white stars would stay on top. So that is not a traditional watercolor action, but it is something that many people find acceptable in terms of if you're entering an art show or something like that and they said that this has to be a watercolor painting. They often have a percentage that you can use, a percentage of non-watercolor paint to be able to add accents to it. And if you're painting for yourself, then it doesn't matter what you do, because it is your own artwork and you can mix as many different things as you want. Alright, so see how I'm adding some more blue to the cow catcher area, and that makes that blue area darker and richer. So it's the exact same blue. It's not that I'm changing the blue or anything, but because I'm adding an additional layer, it's now blocking the paper more. It's blocking the light bouncing through more. That makes it look darker, and the color ends up being more saturated. A little blue into this. Alright. While that's drying, I will rinse my brush, get a little more black, and I'll put another layer of black onto this coal. And you can see how it starts to get darker when we add additional layers. So this is part of the beauty of watercolor, is to add layer after layer. And if you add layers in some areas, it creates shadows. And if you add less layers in other areas, like if we leave the top area of this front with only one layer, then that makes it look like it's got some highlights on it. So that gives a sense maybe that the sun is shining down on it and keeping that area light. Make these connector things nice and dark. So think about light and shadows when you paint too. Think about where the sun is coming from and where it would shine light on and what would end up in shadow. So I tend to have the sun shining from the top right, so this area down here would catch the light, and the areas on the back side would be more in shadow. Alright. Hopefully that blue is dry. It's always an adventure when you're going quickly. Figure out what's dry and what is not dry. It just takes one wet area to touch another wet area to cause a giant blossom, which changes the nature of your painting. Alright, let me know if you have any questions about how any of this process works. Alright, hopefully these blue spoke areas are now dry enough that I can add some black in to the insides of the spokes. So think about when you're designing your colors for your painting that the human eye tends to be drawn to bright white areas and to dark areas. And you want to make sure that those areas are things that you want the viewer to be paying attention to. So if you have a bright white spot in the sky that just happens to be bright, the viewer's eye is going to be drawn there. And do you really want them to be drawn to a random spot in the sky, or do you want them to be drawn to the train? So you would want to make the drain nice and bright, or nice and dark, or a combination of those two things, so that the visual interest draws the person's eye in to look at the thing that you want them to be spending most of their time looking at. And of course they can go look at other parts of the painting. Hopefully they go looking at all of it and appreciating it. But you want their main focus to be drawn into what you think is the focal point of your painting. I'm wondering if my coal car is a little too light. I'm going to finish up my little tire areas and then I will take another look. It's a good idea to sit a little back from your painting every once in a while and look at it as a whole and see how it looks. Yeah, I think the coal car is looking a little light in comparison to the rest of the engine area, so we'll get a little more black paint. And we'll add another layer to the coal car. This is a good challenge for me to be painting sideways around a tripod. Alright, nope, can't do it. Sorry. My arm just does not bend that way. I hope you guys are having a fun time, either watching or painting along. So again, this is to celebrate the railroad trains of old, and in particular the coal trains that began in Grafton, Massachusetts in the late 1800s, and they still have trains there to this day. That's a pretty long legacy. Alright, I think the stack needs, see, now this is where I could sit here playing with this painting for quite a while, saying, oh, let's change this, and oh, let's update that. But at some point you have to call it done enough for now. And the beauty of watercolors is that this will dry, and then you could come back in a couple days and say, oh, I want to add this, or I want to add that, and you just add some more layers to it. So it's not as if you have to do everything right away. You can add things onto it later if you wish. Let's put a little on there. But on the other hand, it's good to have a sense of when to step away and say, okay, this is done enough. I'm going to move on and work on something else. Because otherwise you could just sit there on one painting, adding layer after layer after layer. Well, I suppose we need tracks. Probably be a good thing to have tracks. But we will call that train good enough for now. We're just trying to do an example of how this works. I think that demonstrated our example. Alright, tracks. Could do this with a ruler, but we're just doing get the general sense of tracks. Alright, so it was fairly quick. So I didn't go through a lot of details. I mean, I could add more details to the foreground with some bushes and flowers. I could add more details to this middle ground with bushes. I could add birds to the sky. So there's all sorts of other things you could do to this to add extra levels to it. But hopefully you get the general sense of how a lot of different techniques work. The wet on wet for this background, where I made the paper wet and then added color into the wet, helped the colors flow and spread and be softer, so it gives that background kind of look. And then I did wet on dry, which means the paper was dry, and I used a wet brush with paint to paint in the dry areas, and that gives you a lot more control and keeps the color more concentrated, and that can work really well for a foreground area. But you can mix the techniques up. You can do wet on dry for the whole thing or wet on wet for the whole thing. It is wholly up to you. So let me know if you have any questions about pen and ink with watercolor, and I hope you have a wonderful time painting.